The circumference of my head is 22 inches, so if I'm using a 22-inch mannequin head, and this is the brand cap that I like to use. And right now, for some reason, I just have a thing where I like to know where my ears are going to be, and I'm just making sure that the distance from my ear to the other ear on top of my head is about 12 inches. If it's a little bit off, that's fine, because you do end up pulling the cap while you're sewing anyway, but it's fine. But if it's like, for the most part, around how much it's supposed to be, I'm fine with it. And then I do like to T-pin the cap all around. And when I used to watch a lot of YouTube videos of people making wigs, I noticed that people like to put the hairline of the closure on the cap, but I still like to pull the hairline a little more forward, even though it's a closure. That's just me, and I T-pin it all around. I like having all of my needles sewn in advance because I don't have time for stopping and needling and threading. I don't have time for that. So as you saw already, I did pin the closure down all the way, and I start sewing on one of the corners here, going through the closure first and then through the cap. To knot the closure to make sure it's secure, I would loop the thread around the needle a couple times. There's not a real specific amount of times like, oh, you have to do it 3 times, you have to do it 4 times. No, just make a knot and then make sure it's secure. And while I'm on this thick part of the cap, you see how the cap has a very thick part in the beginning. When I'm sewing on that part, I like to knot it a lot, and I like to do it closer together than when I would do it on the regular part of the cap, but you'll see further along in the video exactly what I mean by that. So I did want to mention that this will be my first time trying to explain how I make wigs or how to sew, period. So if there's anything that I don't really explain clearly, if you still don't understand, feel free to ask me down in the comments. Go ahead and like this video now to get it out the way before we get into things. A lot of this video is repetitive. It's sewing. So after I basically tell you something one time, I don't really have to keep telling you. So some parts of this video will be sped up, but I will let you see how I construct this entire wig by hand. So as I said before, on this thick part of the cap, I like to do it much closer together, and I like to knot it more often than I would on the more meshy thin part of the cap. So now that you guys basically see how I sew going from the closure into the cap first, I'm going to speed these next couple of clips up until I finish. I like to basically take the closure halfway on one side before I stop. I would have stopped usually on the corner. I'm not sure why I went all the way to the back, but I usually would do one full side and then I will go to the other side just to make sure that everything is balanced. There's an equal amount of tension on either side of the closure. It's really going to be in the middle. It's not going to be leaning or anything like that. So definitely keep that tip in mind. Sew one side of the closure. Don't do it all the way to the back and then do the other one, and then you can do the back part. And don't pull too hard because the closure will move and you don't really want to move it out of the place that you just pinned it in. I remember when I first saw somebody mapping out where they're gonna lay their tracks, I'm like, but how many lines do you do, and how do you know? I just remember asking so many questions that were not important really at the time. I'm making this wig for myself, so I'm not really neat about the lines here, but just use this as a general outline for yourself, keeping in mind how many bundles you're using and the style that you want this wig to be in. I'm using bundles from House of Vane, and I'm doubling my first bundle. I'm gonna double my first 2 bundles, but that means that I put the tracks together like this, and I like to sew from underneath. I go from underneath the bundles, and I'm putting the needle through the cap and I push it upwards. And in order to make sure that it is secure, as I was explaining when I was sewing the closure down, I like to knot it a couple times. There's no perfect amount of times to tie the thread around the needle. Tie it around once, twice, 3 times, but do it a couple times, especially on this thicker part of the cap, because as long as the 2 ends on either side are secure, the middle part is not going to fall, because you get what I'm saying, because it doesn't really matter. It's not as important. So the same thing applies on this cap. on this thicker part of the cap, I sew closer together. I make knots more often, and when I get on the meshy part, I sew much spacier, and I don't really knot as often, but I'm going to speed it up, and when I get to the other side or when I have another tip, I'll be back. I just noticed that I did not make it obvious that I did not sew my first track on the thick elastic band at the bottom of the cap. I completely skipped that and I sewed right above it. As I get to the other side, I start making my knots again, but I did also want to point out that you need to sew all the way to the edge of this cap. I like to cut my tracks. These bundles, of course, they can be reused, but when you make a wig out of them, you're not gonna take out your wig and then put them in your head 10 times out of 10. So I don't really mind cutting my tracks. Cutting the tracks is going to make sure that my wig is as flat as possible. I do not like to take my track from the side that I ended on, turning my mannequin head around, and then continuing on the other side. If you finish on the left side, start sewing the next line on the left side and take it to the right and keep doing that. I think that just makes it have much more equal tension throughout the whole wig. I don't know. Try taking that tip into mind and see if you have any changes. But as for everything else, there's no differences with how you're going to sew this. Keep the same advice, the same suggestions that I've given you in mind. I don't really make it a point to not sew on top of these vertical elastic lines that you see coming down the cap. If I sew on it, I sew on it. If I don't, I don't. I really honestly do not think it makes a difference in how your wig will fit. Even if you felt like you sewed all the way to the edge before you cut the tracks, I suggest that after you cut your tracks, you further secure the very corner of the tracks, just to make sure that these tracks do not ever lift while you have this wig. It is so important that your tracks are as flat as possible. You do not want a lumpy wig. That's what makes your wig look like a hat. This is going to be the track that lies right above my ear. So this is going to be the last track that I sew, going just straight across. Every other track after this is going to be curved once I meet the edge of the cap, because that's just going to make sure that a little bit of the hair does fall on my face. This is going to be a part in the middle straight wig, but I still like for a little bit of the hair to kind of fall on the sides of my face a little bit better than I like it just to go straight across and fall straight down. When you start curving your tracks, nothing changes with how you sew. The only thing that changes is the direction that you're turning your wefts in as you sew. And I just wanted to show that, just in case anybody was confused about that at all. If you're anything like me, you want your wig to last. So it's a process, but just take your time, secure your wig so neatly, and you will have a wig that is made nice enough to last over a year, over 2 years. it's already outlined for me to not take this next track all the way to the edges of the cap because there's already so little space as I start curving the tracks up. It's not like I'm going to skip this whole section and miss out on an opportunity to fill in the front and the top of my head, but I'm not going to have the wefts lying on top of each other because that's just going to make the wig lumpy, and that's not a good look. Moving on to the last bundle, I want to set some realistic expectations here. I did not get here in 10 minutes. It was more like 2 hours. And I am going to single this last bundle just to make sure that the top of my head is as flat as possible as we get closer to the closure. And you just want to follow your outline. So as I get to the very top, this last track that is going to be close to the closure, closest to the closure at the edge, I should say, I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap between this track and between the closure. I'm not going to connect the track and the closure in any way. I'm going to make sure that the very tip of the track is as flat as possible into the cap, yes, but I'm not going to connect it because this is just going to allow me to have easy closure replacements if ever I need to, because the closures don't last as long as the bundles. So you still want to make sure you have that little gap. The next bundle on top, not the bundle, I keep mixing up bundle and tracks and wefts. Tracks and wefts are the same thing, but this next track, this next weft on top here, I'm still making sure that that has a space between the closure as well. Anything that is closest to the closure will always have a space in between, but I just wanted to put that out there, but you're still following the same outline that you've been following. This is all the hair that I have left over, which is fine. I'm pretty sure that I can fit it in somewhere, but I don't really care to. And that is how I construct the wig. I hope you guys learned something from this video. If you have any questions, again, don't hesitate to ask me. You do have to cut out this black part of the cap from underneath your closure, and that is all for the inside. If you guys want to see how to add a band inside, I can make a video about that, but I will be showing you guys how to style the top of this closure in my next video, which is very important. So if you guys want to see that, then check out my next video. The dog is barking. I have to go. Thanks for watching. Bye.